for coming and listening on the conversation after work and like being here. I really appreciate it. I kind of want to start out by addressing the quote that's on the projection here by Bell Hooks, and it was included in a book that was published by Deb Willis, picturing us, African American identity and photography in the 90s. And both of these women have been very important in preserving and pioneering the works of African American photographers and really preserving our stories and expanding them and talking about their significance, particularly within like the field of photography. And I studied a lot, read a lot of both of their publications just to try and find the vocabulary and space within the field of photography. As a woman of color, I often do find that, you know, through traditional institutions and through like books of masters, like there's often women's voices are not in it, and African American voices are not in it. So I spent a lot of time sort of going through scholars who like understand like, hey, there's an erasure, there's an absence of voices within certain canons. And this work, this quote that she has, she pretty much talks about the importance of like representation within the field of photography. And I think at the core, that is really what my work seeks to do. It seeks to visualize a Black experience, particularly mine, and it's sort of like nuanced through being a woman and through my own personal experiences. But at the core of what she argues is that like certain canons erase voices out of them. So I just wanted to take a minute to have this quote up so you can take it in and digest it and think about what is not being seen and what's not being recorded. So this is a photograph of my grandmother in the 80s, and it's one of the images. This is sort of related to the work that's on view. This is called Mass Production Comes Home, and it's part of a larger series called Some Assembly Required. And she is the central person within that body of work. And that work really thinks about women's work and women's labor here in America. And I was interested in thinking about that biographically through my own familial history. So she is here protesting, a peaceful protest for jobs, justice, and human rights. And really just thinking about sort of like her story coming here from Jamaica. She immigrated here in the 60s and nestled in New York. And you know, she worked she was a domestic worker. She cleaned houses for 20 years. And then she also worked in a factory. So she spent a lot of time working with her hands and like doing like really hard work, like really hard labor. And there's a tendency to sort of like not value women's work or not consider like working in a factory or like working in the domestic field like as being of value or being of something worth recognizing. So I really wanted to think about how I could focus my work again on like women's experiences, but from a personal standpoint. So that's where it started. And I was also thinking about sort of, you know, at the time that I was making it, like we were in the middle of an election and sort of Trump talking about like shutting off our doors and like thinking about how we select who we want to choose as who's of value and who's not. So it was really important for me to sort of like look back into my own history and see like, well, where does my legacy lie? Where does that come from? So this work is not on view in the gallery today, but it's typically like of life, more than life-size mural. And it's called Women Working at Valley Forge. That was the name of the factory in New York that my grandmother worked at. They manufactured really small car parts, And it's sort of ironic thinking about how something like a factory can be such a machine and generate something so teeny tiny. And she's not easily identifiable, like her identity is obscured. And again, I was sort of thinking about the way in which labor can be like an invisible function, and how as an individual you become erased when you're like working underneath these like large systems. And I found this picture just kind of sorting through my family photographs, and I was kind of like, I want to start here. So this is a work that's not included, but it's sort of the starting point for this series behind me, which I'll talk a little bit about. And this is actually my grandmother. It's called Vernice Acquires the American Dream. There are 3 versions of this photograph, and in the presentation I'm only going to show, of 3 diptychs, but in the presentation I'm only going to show 3 of them. But I was really drawn to this image visually for sort of like the patterns and the texture and the palette and the tone, but also thinking about the aspirations that in the 60s and 70s, like what she was trying to achieve, the American dream, and thinking no matter where you're from when you come into the U.S., that's sort of like the chase that we're all after. That's just like the golden ticket. That's the prize we all want. And how do you show that you've achieved these things? Well, you do it through buying a house. You do it through buying appliances. You do it through sort of like building stability within your homes and within your lives. And thinking about her working as a domestic, like the home becomes not only a place, or like home ownership is not something she's aspiring for, but it's something that she's like working within, and she's helping others like maintain and build. And in my research, when I was like sort of thinking about the choices I was making and how they are connected to history, like in the 60s there were like government agencies that were created to channel like labor in, and it probably still goes on today, but to channel labor in from the Caribbean. And you know, the workers would be brought over, and they would be channeled right into like middle-class white homes, and they would be cleaning homes of white families. So I was really thinking about, again, like this invisibility of like Black female labor and bodies in like stabilizing like the white middle class and helping build that. So it's a really complicated relationship when you think about it, and sort of like she's sort of tied to sort of like this, like the white middle class, but it's not really discussed like on a wider scale. There's a scholar who wrote a whole book, and it was called, I'm probably going to butcher the name, but essentially it's about, I'm totally losing my train of thought, the domestic workers movement and African American women and like their contributions in like fighting for rights for like domestic workers. And she did a phenomenal job, just like really organizing that history, explaining it out. So I spent a lot of time reading that book. But it was like I was reading, because my grandmother's no longer here, but it was like I was sort of getting bits and pieces of her story through this book. And she also, when she wasn't like cleaning middle-class homes, she worked at the New York Presbyterian Hospital in New York. So she spent a lot of time cleaning there. And this is a photograph of her at the bedside cleaning. She definitely, this kind of points back to like the bell hooks and sort of thinking about sort of Black life and everyday life. And there's like a whole tradition of sort of like occupation portraits and thinking about how you photograph yourself at work. And when I was going through her archive, I was really trying to find photographs of her like in her home and outside her home. So this this series is a combination of like both of those settings, both of those areas that she takes up. And this is her inside her kitchen. And it kind of like, these images sort of inform the portraits that are behind me. And so mass production comes home is a series of 9 still lifes, and each of the images present, or each of the objects represent either some sort of a object she kept in her house, whether it was tied to the decorative, or whether it was tied to labor. That labor could be like bodily labor, like taking care of herself, or like household labor. And then there was also, the middle one is a Akikan, so that was sort of like a cultural reference to her identity as a Jamaican woman. But each image sort of like represents an activity or something that happened within her home. And then the Refutation of Good Hair, which is on view, there's a total of 6 of those works, but I only have 5 on display today. But this work really explores sort of like language, what the history of like good hair, the gaze, and also beauty codes. And I made this work in 2012, just after becoming a mother, and sort of thinking about, well, what sort of experiences would my daughter Mia have in terms of like how she dresses herself and dresses her hair. And not much has changed, believe it or not. Like I work as a teacher, an art teacher, and I teach 5th and 6th graders, and a lot of the things that like your mother talks about or your parents talk about, like our kids are sort of like still going through that. Kids can be pretty mean sometimes, and they learn it from somewhere. So this work sort of came out of like wanting to address sort of like beauty standards. So this series is called Gestures of My Biomyth, and it was inspired again by a bell hooks passage that I was reading, and she was talking about Audre Lorde. And the biomythography is like a genre of literature that you sort of, it's based on actual occurrences, but you sort of imagine this like small details, like the scene, the setting, and you sort of like create those details that are based on your own inner feelings or notions. So I was really drawn to that, although it's a literary term, like how that can be adapted photographically. And I think a lot of that is sort of what I do. Like I always kind of start with like a personal experience, but then think about ways that I can imagine it beyond a literal representation of what that experience could have been. But then also at the same time thinking about how you can kind of trouble vision and make a photograph that doesn't actually communicate in a way that is like immediately clear. Like you have to kind of investigate, you have to ask questions, and you have to consider like what could that be? What could this photographer be trying to communicate? And then these series are sort of like, again, looking at representation in product packaging and thinking about how perm kit's an object, or it's a commodified object that is, again, tied to sort of like hair straightening and trying to conform to certain beauty standards, and thinking about like how can we look at these objects for what they are and then sort of critique them for what they're trying to do. So it's definitely trying to destabilize like the lure of the cell, or the illusion of using an image, like seeing yourself in the product that you want to see, by sort of like deface or obscuring the face of the models that are present. And then Nostalgia More Color Brown, which is a series behind us. There's a total of 7 in this series, and I think I only have 5 on view today. But these works, again, are sort of thinking about the intimacy of like your home interiors and how we sort of protect our bodies or do processes onto our bodies. And it's really about sort of like generating a space that is safe sort of like announces itself as like unapologetically like black and magical. And I think the 70s was like the beginning of like black girl magic. So I was just really interested in going back and sort of like finding these small lost treasures. All of these series start off with the album, and then I kind of like build around the album. Like the album and the face is definitely like the central point of each photo. And then Hair Stories Untold, which is a total of 6 photographs. These series are, again, about thinking about like the hair rituals and processes that are tied to black womanhood and girlhood, and about like thinking about how objects and different like beauty strategies can be visualized within a photograph. Like a lot of my work is about trying to visualize these really obscure corners and facets of, you know, my life, and like trying to bring it to the forefront. So I think we could just go step right into the convo.
Let's do it. So you're speaking a lot about erasure and invisible labor and domestic labor. And there's another, when I look at these photographs, one of the things that I think about is sort of a labor of appropriateness that black women have to perform in America. We've had a ton of pop cultural stories, especially like in the past couple years, about black women's battle to be seen as appropriate. So like there was a story about, I think it even was like in the military, they were arguing about letting black female soldiers braid their hair and whether or not that was an appropriate tidy thing to do for soldiers. And during the Olympics, however many years ago that was, Gabby Douglas was attacked for having hair sticking out of little places and how that wasn't appropriate for this sort of tightly uniformed way that the American gymnastics team was trying to like dress themselves and present themselves. And so in looking at these photographs and thinking about invisible labor, I'm also thinking about this, again, this labor of appropriateness that is invisible to people that would critique the way that black women choose to handle their hair, all in the service of looking appropriate in a certain environment. So how does that sort of appropriateness or grasping for appropriateness play into the way that you pose and style and compose these photographs and tell these stories?
Well, I think that in terms of what I'm choosing to work with, like working with perm kits, like a perm kit is like the epitome of like appropriateness. Putting a shower cap on your hair so it doesn't, you know, you don't mess up your style, or like sleeping with a satin cap, blow dryers, like all these things are like objects that sort of help you come to like appropriateness. And I think for me, like the like very nature of being a woman is like so much about behavior and so much about like how you go out and conduct yourself and behave, and how you sort of like navigate the space for other people's level of comfort, you know? And I think the way in which I'm trying to like shift that like sense of comfort is through the obscuring and the sort of like doing uncanny things within the photograph, like sort of like taking a track and like a hair, like track, you know, tracks that you put in your hair, and like obscuring a face so all you're looking at is like hair and a body. Or in the Refutation of Good Hair, where you're like looking at women actually like consuming and eating the hair, but doing it in a way that is like very calm, and they're sort of looking into your eyes directly like, hey, yes, this is what I'm doing. And it kind of comes about like with an ease and a casualness. So there are little ways that I try and think about how you can make a photograph complicate the way that like appropriateness like looks, and it's through like strategies such as like obscuring a face, refusing the gaze, sort of like removing a body, or putting a telephone and a hair dryer together in a space, but putting the hair dryer on top of the telephone. It's sort of like taking these objects that function in a certain way and making them do something else. So I think at the same time, my work definitely does celebrate like self-care, and it does like I handle all of my images with delicacy and with care, because I think you have to be careful, you know, like you don't want to like take an image, and like images are so powerful and they can just run away from what like you originally intended. So I'm always like very careful with the way that I treat the Black female body and like experiences, and thinking about ways to not always make the body objectified or like putting the body at the center, but like how else can we have these conversations that sort of bring other facets to the forefront.
You've objectified the tools instead, which I think is really clever and smart. Again, in talking about erasure, lots of these tools are like sort of invisible things. Like I remember in my house there was like a box where all these things were kept, and that box was like under the sink. And it's like these tools were invisible until they were needed, and then they came out and you had like a very specific sort of interaction with them. So it's really striking to like take a moment and look at the tools, the way that you've composed these images, and kind of borrow. You talked about still lifes in your presentation, so even borrowing from the language of painting as a photographer, the way that these things are composed and colored, and making the hair and the tools of the hair the subject of what's being objectified instead of the female body, which I think is really, really clever. And I want to ask you about the hair and the tracks and the things that you bought. I think that lots of people don't realize, unless they handle these things every day, that this is like $1 billion industry.
Big money, yeah.
Right, so can you talk a little bit about how that plays into composing these things as objects? Do you think a lot about like the capitalism involved, specifically as it's catalyzed by the Black community in buying these objects and tools, and the tremendous amount of financial capital that goes into this sort of appropriateness?
I don't think I thought about it directly until I started making the perm kits. Because when I bought those, I actually some of them I bought for like $1 or like 75 cents from a beauty supply store that was going out of business around the corner from my house. God knows, like that one chemical, the Vigorol, is from like literally probably from like the 70s or 80s, and I'm like, why is this even on a shelf right now? And so that at the same time I was listening, like, yeah, why is this? Why am I being sold this product that's probably like older than me right now? Like, why is that allowed? Like, why is this in my neighborhood? So, so thinking about what is circulating within the American beauty markets, like capitalism is like this machine, like this beast that it's like never stops eating. It's always hungry, and it doesn't care like what it just eats everything in its place. So I think that that kind of drove me to then okay, what else is what other perm kits are out there? What else can I get? And then when I noticed that there were the symbols, Abahi symbols on each of the perm kits, which signifies it's a Black-owned company, and I was again thinking about within the hair industry, Black women, if we're not styling hair, there's just not a lot of ownership in the industry. So it's we are we're not buying from our people. We're not if the money's not coming into our communities, how are we going to better ourselves? So in looking at that, and this is not something new. We've been trying to figure this out for years. The Abahi organization started in the 90s because they were really trying to call out white-owned companies for marketing and operating under the guise of a Black-owned company, and using the Black power symbols, or putting Africa on their oils and their pomades, and trying to they're like using black dollars and like operating underneath the skies of like blackness. So I was really interested in that sense, but like you couldn't tell by looking at the perm kits unless you like went in and tried to examine. Like you had to look at the back, and it's like this little tiny head with like a woman's hair flowing in the back. So it was like kind of really hard to tell whether it was black owned or not. But you know, that just goes to show that like at this time, like we're still trying to figure out like ownership and trying to figure out how we can, you know, not necessarily just be buying, but not like building off of what we're buying.
Thinking about things like chemical relaxers, especially in the 70s, there's a sort of almost violence to the act of like chemically straightening your hair, especially back then, because like, I mean, nowadays everything says like no lie on it because they're trying they're trying to sort of change and make safer some of these practices for straightening and having good hair. So to look at these objects and evaluate them in a way that people might not understand is like a sort of violent or heavy thing that you have to do to yourself to have this very appropriate looking hair. You have used sort of the language of advertising and like beautiful poppy colors. Can you talk a little bit about that? That friction, this violence sort of up against like a candy-coated advertisement.
Yeah. I have like just like a natural affinity for like qualities such as like color, design, and that's something in me that I just can't stop. Like that's just like the artistic tick in me. That's just when you come to a Nakeya Brown work, like you know that's what you're just gonna get. The meaning is coded, it's layered, it's about going deeper, and I think for me again, it's sort of about thinking about the working with still lifes and working with staging, like sort of like building a photograph and like taking time to like make this photograph your own and make this photograph look pleasing. Like that sort of like draws people in. Like that is something that as humans is just like, we like to look at things that look good. That is just the nature of, you know, the way we are. So, just sort of like balancing like that formal tick, like artistic tick within me, and then also just the irony and like thinking about, well, like these look great, but there's like these invisible, like sensory memories that come to mind when I look at it, but at the same time, this is just so deeply rooted in like who I am and my identity to like completely throw it out the window and trash it and say like, this is not what, like I just can't do that. Like I just can't handle things such as like my personal experiences without like care. So I think it's a little bit of like not fighting those two impulses to like handle things with care and with like a certain level of delicacy, but then to also try and like really work through some of the issues that I was thinking about at the time that I was making the work.
I want to talk a little bit about the language that you use, especially for the series, The Refutation of Good Hair. I want to talk about good hair as like an inherently problematic term, and then the ways that you are trying to refute that terminology within the images that you're making. So what feels problematic, I think, to all of us about the term good hair is that for a lot of people, the degree to which your hair is good is also the degree to which it sort of visually seems removed from the diaspora. So like if you're, for a lot of women that are mixed race, they get told that they have good hair because it's not quite as coarse or kinky, or it grows longer, or whatever that person's specific standards for good hair is. So can you talk a little bit about how you grapple with the term good hair and why you called the series that, and the ways in which you hope to refute that language or terminology?
Yeah. So I went natural and was sort of like in this moment of like feeling like, oh, like I just cut my hair, like I'm so poppin', like I love my curls, like I didn't even know my hair curled, and I'm gonna have this afro, and you know, it was like a very important moment for me that like I kind of felt like I was like maturing into something beyond what I had like been before I cut my hair, and like sort of being met with the reality of like, oh, you haven't, like you cut your hair, you have an afro, like how are you gonna get a job, like, and then like trying to figure out like how am I going to now relearn how to work with my hair, because like I never spent time with it before. And then as it starts growing and you start to understand like the fullness of your texture, you start to see like, oh, I'm like really different. Like there are a lot of women out here who don't have like texture like me, and then you realize like, hey, I don't really see myself on TV, and I don't see myself in magazines, and like you don't really see yourself. So I was like realizing that, and wanted to make a body of work about that. Became a mom, and so she was like laying on my lap, and we were like rocking the chair, and I was like looking at her hair, and she had like that newborn hair that's like all silky and like black and soft, and I was kind of in my head like, she gonna have like curly, kinky hair like me, and I was like, it's not gonna look this way, but it was like that reality. I was like, well, she's gonna be treated differently. Like, and it was just that moment of myself, like with myself, like at 24, just sitting in my living room, like looking at my baby and being like, oh, she's gonna have a totally different experience. And it's like because of like something that she has no control over. And I think it was like that realization that I was kind of like, oh, like, this is like really a problem. And like I need to make a body of work that like addresses it. So, and then like it never really goes like the good hair phrase, like it's never gone away. Like at 24, like I knew what it was. So like it's being used and it's being thrown around, and it's so I wanted to make a body of work that sort of like addressed that. And each of the girls that I used, like they're wearing all different styles. Like there's one girl just doesn't have hair, she just cut it off because she just felt like it. And another friend has like a weave in, but she's natural underneath. And I had another friend who wore an afro, and then my cousin who's in there, she had locks. So it was looking at like the fullness of what Black women are doing with our bodies, and like how we're picking and we're choosing and we're wearing styles in all different ways, no matter what we're being hit with. And so I really wanted to address like I didn't want to sweep like the good hair phrase under the rug, because it's like, all right, well, you're still thinking about it, it's still in your psyche, it's still circulating. So I'm not gonna not use that phrase because it makes someone else uncomfortable. Because what I'm trying to do with it is like recontextualize it, and doing it by showing you like the absurdity in it, and showing you the way in which it can be debilitating, like it can really affect you, and it's really a problem. So it was really about like taking what I had already known and trying to figure out a way to like look at it in a different way and recontextualize it.
The other thing about that series is that it's the most active. So we talked about like objecthood and still lifes, and that series in particular, there's something you intentionally engineered, like a performativity out of those portraits. So I want to talk a little bit about performativity and digestibility, which is I got to write about your work, and that was the first thing that I was thinking when I saw them putting this hair in their mouths, was that maybe it was a comment on like a desire or a play of having whatever sort of hair you have be visibly digestible to people who encounter you on the street. And that's one of the things that I think is appealing to some people about working to have straighter hair, if that's what they choose, is just because when non-Black people see you on the street, there's something almost kin about seeing you not have an afro. Like there's something more visually digestible about the way that they choose to interact with you, if that's what you've chosen to do. So can you talk a little bit about that sort of digestibility in your images, and then also performativity, because there is a way in which transforming your likeness in this way that some Black women go to great lengths to do is performative and is a way of feeling safe in a world where they feel like they have to perform a certain sort of aesthetic. So how did you handle those two things in asking these models to perform this gesture eating this hair?
Yeah, well, for me, the taking in of, I mean, there's so many different ways that you can interpret a work. And I think when I was making the work, the Kanekalon hair really symbolized for me sort of like the ideas and the notions that we take into our lives. So I was more or less thinking about the way that, like, the idea, or like the idea of good hair, like what that looks like. Like, it wasn't so much about sort of like, can you look at me and digest the way I look as is? But more about like, within the world, within society, there's like coded language. Like there are ways that, there are unspoken understandings. So I was more so thinking about like that hair symbolizing like that larger aspiration for like beauty. And then when I approached the models in terms of like, this is what I want you to do, I was like, hey, I just want you to, take this hair and just put it in your mouth. You don't have to actually eat it, but if you like, I just want you to put it in your mouth and just like pretend like you're like, imply that's what you're doing. And I would say like that was at most the directions I gave them. Some of them had like really got into it and were like doing all sorts of different things and like giving me growls and like giving me eye contact, and like each of them sort of like handled it in their own way. Like it wasn't like, okay, everyone has to do the same exact thing. And I mean, it might come across that way through like the nature of like editing and like with my own eye and like my choices, where I'm kind of like, all right, well, I need each of these images to speak to each other. So there's like a consistency in the way in which they're sort of like holding it like below or above themselves. But really they sort of, there was like a balance between like them doing what I told them to do and then me leaving a little bit of room for them to like try and figure out this like very awkward gesture that I'm asking of them. And just kind of like going through my roles and seeing what I like the most and putting it out in the world.
Are you ready for some outside questions?
Oh yeah, nice.
Does anyone have any questions for Nakeya?
I like what you said about navigate the space and other people's comfort. That's perfect. In the Bell Hooks paragraph, she said something about construction of a Black aesthetic. So could you talk a little bit about what you mean by that?
Yeah.
Or what you think she means by that?
Yeah, I think what she's thinking about is not trying to create an image out of another person's comfort. I think it's about thinking about like how you are as you are. So if that's you choose to wear your hair in an afro, or if you choose to lock your hair, or if you choose not to have hair at all, like really owning that decision and saying like, I'm not gonna apologize for it. But also on another level, just like the aesthetics, it's like there's something like very visual about that. And making sure that you're being seen. And like, because she's like sort of, she was mediating on photography, like Black aesthetics are sort of contained in photographs. Like how do you preserve what something looks like? How do you preserve like your identity? You do these things like through photographs. Like photographs carry these stories. So I really think that it's really about like embracing who you are and thinking about like Black aesthetics, like what are we doing in our homes? Like how is our identity as like a Black person, like what exactly, because it's different, like it's like there's like cultural differences. So like really going in, carving out what those cultural differences are, and like how can who you are, how does like your racial makeup, like how does that sort of like shape your own experiences? And but like at a very basic level, like for me, Black aesthetics is like Black culture, but thinking about that like visually, like how do you bring that into something that's like is seen and not swept under the rug and like put on the margins? Like how do you put that at the center?
Any other questions?
About the book.
Mm-hmm.
One of the interesting things that I think Black women are doing collectively in curating some images that are affirming is using social media, Instagram, for example, to create feeds of information that reflect beauty and they're curating their own cultural space. How are you interacting with new media or social media with the images that you create? Are you experimenting?
That's a good question. Not right. I feel like right now, I definitely was informed. Like, social media has definitely been influential in the way that I think. When I was telling Chris and Sage in the car, like, when I first started doing photography, I was like on MySpace and on like Flickr, which are like social media like communities for like music and photography. So like I definitely like my photography practice has definitely been hanging out with the internet since like, I first sort of started. But I remember like when I was making the If Nostalgia Were Colored Brown, I would like hang out in my living room on like Sunday afternoons and like arrange things and like take a photo through a square and like put it on Instagram, and like I would just get so many responses from people who were just like, I'm in love, like this is beautiful, like thank you for putting this like enclosing this in an image. And I think like that's sort of like kind of how I started experimenting is like making things at home and then putting it online, and then like making things at home and then putting it online. So definitely sort of like being tethered to social media has definitely informed the way I work. Like some of the images are squares, which I'm like, all right, well I'm probably a lover of Instagram and like the vintage square portrait, like sort of, it's interesting to see how these things like adapt. But yeah, there are a lot of sort of like online, like social media accounts that are tied to like Black hair that have like been pushing my work and like advocated for it. And I think that it's really important that we have like these very specific channels, because I like Black women have been championing my work since day one, and like I think it's like really within those like spaces like online where the work like grew and spread, and it really started off in like one place and then just like grew like everywhere. So I really, really appreciate like the power of the internet for that reason, because you can really find what you're looking for in the space that you need if you look in the right place. So.
Anyone else?
This all sounds so familiar to me as a woman, much of it. Do you think there's a male corollary to this space that you inhabit as a Black woman? I mean, you're not a man, so I'm asking you to speculate here.
No, yeah, I understand. I don't see why not. I don't see why, and I get that question a lot often, like from men. They're like, when are you going to start talking about male stories? I'm like, why don't you do it? Like, why do I have, like, you can do it, But yeah, I think there is an equivalent. men groom and handle their body. Men deal with pressures to like have a certain physique and look a certain way, and like what does masculinity look like? I think that that's something that's a lot of that's what we're starting to question. Like, you know, so I definitely think that there's an equivalent. Like men have barbershops, we have beauty shops. So what's happening in barbershops? I don't hang out in barbershops. I can't really talk about it, but you can if you want. Men have appeared on vinyls. Men perm their hair. So it's like who wants to be that storyteller? Like who wants to narrate that story? So I absolutely think that, you know, there's a male equivalent. It's just a matter of like finding someone who wants to tell that story.
You just gave me a really funny, like, coming to America flashback. Like, so long. Any other questions?
How much do you get the sense that a lot of your contemporaries understand what you're speaking to in your work, insofar as that you might not have shown them your work or explained it to them? Like, how much like this message is pervasive among your friends and community?
I think they get a lot of my friends, like they understand the subjectivity behind it. They understand sort of like the personal experience, if they have those shared experiences. Some of the more like abstracted ideas about like, all right, well, I'm gonna make this object function in a way that it doesn't normally function. Like that might kind of require a little bit of communicating and talking to, but I would say when I first started making my work, I wasn't really thinking about anyone but Black women. So I wasn't really worried about whether the message would get across or not, because if you had a connection to it innately, like it would come, and if you didn't have a connection, all you have to do is ask. But I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Well, I meant insofar as other Black women.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wasn't worried. Like I felt like, you know, we talk like, you know, it's something that when you have conversations, like we talk about these things. So we talk about self-care. We talk about like, oh Lord, like how am I gonna get a job with an afro? Like people are telling me I'm not gonna get hired. Like how much did you spend on that hair? Like we talk about these things. So I was sort of like, it just felt very natural. Like I had no doubt in my mind that it would be understood.
Also, just to mention really quickly, a lot of this stuff starts like when we're children.
Yeah,
like there are perms called Just For Me that have like little kids' faces on them. So like this is something that like as Black women we're very familiar with from like way earlier.
Right. From like 6, like
yeah, this is like a conversation that takes place from the jump. So I think it within the Black female community, I think there's nothing to even explain.
yeah, they're kind of like, yeah, I get it.
Keon has a question.
I kind of have two questions that maybe really, I don't know. But one kind of piggybacking on that question and thinking about the invisible labor and ideas of this labor, yes, being invisible for I think a lot of reasons, not only purpose on these things, but also kind of one of those self-induced invisible, or like not wanting, like giving tales about how this work happens, like not wanting to give tales about how this work happens, or share this information publicly about how this work happens. And so I wonder, and I also think about this a lot too in work, like how do you as an artist almost kind of giving tales of this work, and thinking about Black women in relationship to this, and like how do you give that, especially like in these spaces or in certain spaces, like I definitely hear online and like being in touch with folks within in these spaces, and on the white space and this sort of thing. And how do you deal with that, do that? And then I really am so struck in the perm pieces about how a lot of the faces were obscured by the bottom, but it's kind of dug out sometimes. So that's why I was saying these questions may not be related, but also are, you know,
About showing in primarily white institutions. I just come in and I just do my thing. Like, I just tell my truth as I know it, and I don't really, I mean, yeah, there is a certain level of discomfort that comes when you're like, all right, I'm about to just give you a whole lot of information. So it's like, you know, don't take this as just, you know, an art exhibition. Like, there are like real, like deeply rooted issues that are like a part of this. But I think within my practice, I've always wanted to celebrate and sort of like be proud about like what my truth is, what my experiences are. Like, they're not, you know, they're hard, but like I think that just as people, as humans, like we're sort of taught to like beautify your pain or sort of like suppress your pain or try and, you know, communicate it in a way that kind of shows that like, hey, like I can get through this. So, you know, that probably happens a little bit through some of my work, but like I said, I just, wherever the work goes, I let it go. Like you know, they're here for a purpose, and they need to serve their purpose. So that's sort of how I look at being an African American woman and showing in a primarily white space. It's like, this is my truth, and I'm not going to apologize for it. In terms of I think you were asking about the perm kits and obscuring the face. Yeah, it's again like making like, I'm really interested in like doing like subtle gestures, like through like arrangement or staging to sort of like subvert what the photograph is meant to do, and whether that photograph is like the actual photograph that I took or like the photograph within the product packaging. But again, thinking about like how these chemicals obscure identities, how we sort of like how we're like erased through like this notion of trying to achieve beauty. Like, it's complicated. Like, in one image, like in one series, I'm doing one thing, and in another series, I'm doing another thing, because like there is, like, I don't think it's been fully resolved. So for my work to be like, oh, this is how it's fully, like, my work is not going to resolve it, but I think it does provoke sort of like counterpoints and different viewpoints, and that's really what, you know, I wanted to do, is like to provoke those conversations and allowing people to speak their truths.
Other questions?
You mentioned you have a daughter.
Do?
Do you think you'll incorporate her in your work, as like motherhood, like adventure, or do you have any works coming?
After seeing Sage's work, where's Sage? Where is she? Yeah, I was like, yeah, I totally want to do that. I'm gonna put my baby to work. But she's 5 now, so like even when she was born, like that was something I wanted to do. But like now she's really developing into herself, and she's like been in galleries and worked through them, and she's seen the work. So I'm really interested in like sort of like documenting our life from like now on, like forward. So yeah, that's something I actually was thinking about like in bed before I like, fell asleep. I was like, oh, I'm gonna start doing that. So we'll see where my practice goes. We'll see.
We can do one last question if someone has one more. No? Okay.
I'll just ask a silly question, like, when did afros go out of, historical question, when did they go out of fashion? Like, they were so fashionable, you know.
I think they're, yeah, I feel like it happened in like the fall of like the 70s, and like in the 80s when like perms and like jerry curls were like came in.
It like turned into like flat tops and
Flat
fades.
tops and fades and things of that
You
nature.
still needed the height, but it had different shape.
Yeah, that's for sure. But it's interesting in thinking about sort of like what it means politically, how that has shifted from the 60s and 70s. It kind of like went away in the 80s. It never went away, but in like the public sphere, the 90s, and something happened in 2000 that like it resurfaced, and you know,
With a vengeance.
with
Well, thank you so much for being here and sharing this with